Okay, we'll see how this works. I was having trouble getting here, so I'm not sure if this is going to work, but we'll try it anyway. Um, I could say I'm practicing it, and I've practiced it, and it hasn't worked at all. But anyway, back to the practice. Before I really get into the idea of why practice may or may not work, or what you've been told about practice, let me give you a bit of the research so you know that I'm just not pulling this out of thin air just because it, is the way I thought about it when I got up this morning. What I'm going to start with is a study that happened in 1978 or thereabouts, a long time ago, in other words, in which basically, to simplify it, two researchers had a bunch of children take bean bags and toss them in spots on the floor. No big deal. The study is a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic result. What they had is two different groups. Somebody was throwing and practicing at a spot on the floor that was 3 feet in front of the child. Another group was tossing the bean bags at places that were like 2 feet and 5 feet in front of the children. So they were doing different spots on the floor, but basically the same issue. Then later, they went back and tested the children and basically said which group of children are going to do the best with tossing the bean bag to the spot on the 3 feet from the floor. Surprisingly, the people who did the 2 and the 5 foot tosses were the ones who did better than the 3 foot group. Even though they practiced that specific spot, the other group tended to do better as a group than the one who specifically studied for that one spot. Okay? This study sort of got ignored for a while until people started noticing other things about practice, and then they dug it up and started doing other things. And what they've done recently meaning like in the last 20 or 30 years, is they'll do things like, say, have people practice tennis or basketball shots in which you do something in that specific spot. So if you're playing badminton, try and practice, you go over to that spot, go over to that spot, go over to that spot, and practice. The other group would have somebody, a coach, say, go over to that spot, now go over to here, go over to there, go over to there, go over there. And they did a variety of different shots. This would apply to basketball if you practice a particular shot for basketball, or if you tried any particular sport and you were doing one thing over and over and over again with the idea of practicing that one thing to get to where you wanted to go, versus the idea of changing that and doing a variety of different things. Again, the people who did the practice in a variety of different things tended to do better than the people who did just the one practice. This surprised people, and they gave it some thought, and they decided that maybe this had something to do with the fact that let me back up. When you do something, you generally don't practice that thing in that way, or that you don't do whatever it is you practice that thing in that way. So let's say you're driving and you're practicing how to make a right turn. Uh, if you're practicing it, you're going to be practicing it under a pretty good set of quiet, peaceful examples because the instructor wants you to not have a lot of distractions. But the thing about it is you don't do it in those particular situations. You usually make right turns in situations in which there's a bunch of other stuff going on. So the thought is that we do better when we practice in different situations, because then when we have reality set in, the brain is more likely to make adjustments because the situation is different. So in other words, if you practice in the ideal situation, you're probably never going to have an ideal situation. So you're not going to do as well as if you practice in a variety of situations, so that when you do get into the situation in which you need to do it, you're more likely to be able to accomplish the task. Does that make sense? So that if you're trying to improve a sport or some such thing like that, whatever that may be, do a variety of different things because you're going to work out better anyway. Now, what does this have to do with learning in general, say like learning algebra or whatever? I'm going to go with something simple like flashcards. How many of you ever remember using flashcards? And you'd go up and you pick the card up and you pick the card up and you get the next card. And sooner or later, you realize that not only did you know the answer to that card, you knew the answers to the next 3 cards in sequence. And you thought, I know these words. And then you got into the test and then you did poorly and you say, well, I just went and I just had a blank. It didn't work. I just sort of, just the test results or whatever it was you said. People are starting to take a look at the idea that, in a sense, that this is kind of like the practice situation I was discussing. See, well, when you do things like study something that's sequential in the same way, you're not as likely to get that in your head and to learn it as when you do it in different ways. So in other words, back to the flashcards. Don't just put a set of flashcards for vocabulary words. Do something like shuffle the cards. Go through them all, shuffle them, go through them all, shuffle them. Or better yet, the one technique I like is don't do it wildly, but somewhere in a nice, quiet way, just sort of like toss them around you. And then pick them up according to where they land. So in some cases, you might pick them up. Let's say you're learning a foreign language and you're learning the English word and have to find the French word or whatever. So sometimes you'll pick up the English word, you have to remember the French word. Sometimes you'll pick up the French word and you have to remember the English word. And sometimes you'll do it in sequence of maybe 3 English words in succession, and then you've got a French word. So in other words, what you're doing is you're making it more random than you did if you just put a stack of flashcards and going through one card after another, after another, after another. So you're more likely to remember them in a random sequence because you didn't learn them in that one specific sequence of just going one card after one card after one card after one card. Does that make sense? So when you're doing other things and you're studying, then they started taking a look at taking breaks. And I think I may have mentioned this in the last couple of times. If you take something and you just study intensely for a particular list, let's go back to the vocabulary words. All you're doing is you're studying those 10 vocabulary words. And that's it. And then your next study session is doing those next 10 vocabulary or the same 10 vocabulary words. Again, when you take the test, you probably won't do as well if you vary the vocabulary words or if you intersperse them with random words. So if you have a list of words that you have to learn because it's in your textbook and that's what you have to learn for that week, pick up a couple of other words. Find it from somebody else, maybe add a word from the past lessons, look forward to our next lesson, find somebody who's, if you're in class, see if you can find somebody, a student who's at a higher level and pick up another couple of words and intersperse them. In other words, you're making it more random. Your brain does better when it's got a random pattern because it forces it to, in a sense, make connections to what you've got in that information. It gets lazy, if you will, when all you do is you go after the same thing. You've done it for 14 times in sequence. Again, like the flashcards. So if all you're doing is going one card after another and you do that every single day, it's not going to be as good as if you intersperse those and do something randomly. Also, if you interrupt yourself with a variety of tasks, in other words, you study for something for 10 minutes and then that's it. Maybe the next study session, you do something for another 20 minutes, and then another session, you do it for 30 minutes, then back to 10 minutes. If you interrupted and stopped in different places, again, your brain is forced to work. Heaven forbid you do that. And it starts making connections as opposed to when it becomes lazy, if you will, because everything just comes in a particular sequence. This is essentially good for us as humans because in reality, nothing comes in just the plain old normal everyday sequence. Things just don't come the way they're supposed to. How many of you learned to do something like driving or any other skill, and then you had to do it, quote, in real life, and you said you messed it up because that's not the way it was? Or what's infamous for classrooms is you study for a test, and then you say, well, that was a trick test because those weren't the questions that we studied. What you did is you memorized essentially a specific set of things, whatever that was. And then when you got something else to take the test on, that means you didn't understand the principles. All you did was learn those particular things specifically, like how to spell a specific word. So if somebody gives you a different word, you can't spell it because that's not what you studied. You didn't learn the material. Okay? So if you can toss a little randomness in there, change your study times, change your study places, you'll start doing a little bit better, most likely, over the course of time than when you just try and do the same thing every single time. So you need to vary your practice sessions instead of just doing the same thing every time you practice. Does this make sense? I hope so. I hope it helps. And if you've got children that you're trying to teach, make sure that they do something different. They're not sitting in the same place all the time. Maybe you do vocabulary words at the dining room table, then the next time maybe they're not going to like it, mind you, but they're in the car going to a movie or some such thing like that. Quiz them. Do something in different places when they don't expect it And the same thing goes for you too, because it works for you and adults as well as it does for children. I do different circumstances so that you get to pull those things up at different unexpected situations, and you're more likely to remember it when you need it, like taking a test or sometime later. If you're going back to the French, when you talk to somebody who speaks French, you're more likely, perhaps within a small frame of reference, if you're only beginning French, to understand whatever the words are. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, ask me and share it with somebody else, and just let me know if you found that useful. So before Penny goes crazy, we'll see you later. Bye.